Hey yos, what's up? What's going down? So how do you make a great fantasy movie? What makes a great fantasy movie? Why are some fantasy movies amazing and other fantasy movies B and cult hits and not necessarily great and low budget and bad or something, right? Why are some fantasy movies not good and some fantasy movies are great? Great fantasy movies are fantasy movies that are loved not just by people that are into fantasy movies, but people that just are not into fantasy movies that just think it's a great movie. Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator. There's tons of fantasy movies that came out. Lord of the Rings hit it really big. Game of Thrones. People who were not into fantasy, I know like people who are just completely not into fantasy, love Game of Thrones. It's just like it really hits it off with them. Same with Lord of the Rings. It's like people don't really like. I mean, some people like fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, but other people are just like they're not really fantasy. But Harry Potter, yes. Lord of the Rings, yes. So why are these things great while other ones like Krull, which is a good movie, doesn't get a lot of like credit. Same with Logan's Run, doesn't get a lot of credit. Some of the movies that came out that are fantasy are just like they don't get a lot of great credit. And I think the first reason is that why some fantasy movies don't get a lot of credit is because if you go all the way back to like the 70s, the 80s and stuff like that, you're going to see even before that, the special effects in fantasy movies and sci-fi movies, but basically in fantasy movies was so bad. It was so bad. And if you wanted really good at special effects, they would be expensive. If you remember like the Godzilla films, it was obvious that there was a person in a rubber Godzilla suit walking over a miniature Tokyo, crushing all the buildings. It was obvious that that was just bad. I mean, you look at it and it's just like horrible. You could tell that these giant robots are supposed to be these mech robot giant flying creatures in the air. They're just, they're just a guy in a suit, And it's just bad. Like, even if you look at, some movies came out, they had really good special effects, like Star Wars had good special effects, but it was just obvious when you look at the Wookiee, when you look at Chewbacca, the Wookiee, he's obviously a guy in a big furry suit. It's just obvious that that's what that is. And the special effects are really bad. I mean, in that movie, special effects are good, but in order to get special effects good to some standard in that movie, in that trilogy, it took millions of dollars of special effects funding just to put that into the special effects. So all of the money in fantasy movies goes into special effects, right? It doesn't go into getting a better actor. It doesn't go into, because they can get B actors and they don't really care. I don't think that they got Arnold Schwarzenegger for Conan the Barbarian because he's a great actor. At the time, he was not really a great actor. He was just a beginning actor. This was the beginning of his career. The only movie he did before that was Hercules, and it was a very bad movie. The guy had a strong Austrian accent, which is cool. I mean, he sounded like a barbarian would sound, right? And that made him part of the role, but he didn't say a lot in that movie. And it was a great movie. And obviously, there's a lot of reasons why it was a great movie. And I think it was because Arnold Schwarzenegger and everyone else that made that movie, the writers, the director, the art direction, the costumes, everyone that made that movie took it very, very seriously. And I think why there's a lot of like bad fantasy movies is because it's sometimes the script or the story is just so far out that people just can't take it seriously. Like superhero movies. That's really a person running around in a weird suit, fighting crime, with some kind of weapons. That's not really a gun. They're just some kind of weapon. Like, a weird thing. It's just like, superheroes caught on. I think part of the reason was because it was weird. If you go back to the Batman that came out, like, I don't know if it was the 70s or 80s, I think it was the 70s, the Batman that came out, the Batman TV show with Burt Ward and all those people, it was just it was a funny take on a superhero story. It was very, very comedic. There was a lot of like humor in it. It wasn't a serious thing, and they meant it as a comedy, and it came across as a comedy. It was an adventure comedy, all that, but it was basically funny, because they knew how weird the concept was, and everyone's like, okay, let's play this weird concept to the T. But whereas like Conan the Barbarian, everyone took it seriously. Even if you look at something like The Terminator, they took that seriously too. I mean, everyone, like you believe the guy when he goes back in time and says, we have to save you because if we don't save you, the robots win in the future. Look at The Matrix. What was the difference between The Matrix and a different fantasy movie that wasn't good? And one of the reasons is, I mean, they got Keanu Reeves. Okay, with most fantasy movies, if you look at the Troma movies, with like Toxic Avenger, those guys that made Toxic Avenger, the Troma movies are meant to be B movies. They're meant to be cult movies. And the actors they use, actors and actresses they use, they hardly pay them at all. And they're not professional actors. And I think a lot of professional actors, just like, unless they were fans of fantasy and sci-fi, just stayed away from it. Because they were just like, yeah, I could be in this weird movie with like, I gotta run around with like a laser gun and shoot aliens or whatever it is, but is it really going to be good for my career to do that? Are people going to think of me more as this weird story, like actor, actress, whatever? And so there was a lot of distaste. And I think part of the reason that a lot of people looked at fantasy movies in a bad way was because a lot of them were bad. And I think a lot of them were bad because the budget basically went to all special effects. They focused on the special effects more than anything else. And the thing is about fantasy movies, and one of the reasons why people watch those, is the special effects. And I think that's why, like, in the current age, right after CGI, right after computer generated special effects, a lot more people started to like fantasy movies. And that's just because the effects were better. And they were also cheaper. So your budget for the special effects was like reasonable. You can pretty much get somebody who knows how to 3D render or use some software, who's a good artist, a few people that know how to do that, and that's our art team and stuff like that. And they'll make all the special effects. They'll create the monsters, they'll create the spells and all the magic and the whirly, flamey swords and all the different weapons and stuff like that. The backgrounds that look like castles and dragons flying in the air. They can do this, and it's not going to break the bank. It's not like, people have to sit there with like little clay miniatures and then move them around and take like one picture at a time to make it look like the miniature is actually moving on its own, like Roy Harryhausen, And so when they stopped doing the bad special effects, a lot more people and I think just generally fantasy movies became a lot more popular because just people took it more seriously. Because the thing is, like, a good fantasy movie is a movie that everyone that's involved in the movie takes it seriously. The actors, directors, and even when you watch the movie, you take it seriously. A lot of times, if you look at something like Back to the Future, which was a fantasy movie, you kind of like get into the whole story and you take it seriously and you're rooting for, Marty McFly to actually, succeed and save his parents in the past so that he saves his own future and all that stuff that's going on. Because he takes it seriously. I mean, like, he takes it seriously. And even though it's a wild story, a wild plot, like he goes in the past, meets his parents, messes up their relationship, and now his parents are never going to meet and never going to have him, and his future is gone. Now he has to put everything back together again. Some people can look at that as that's a weird plot and not take it seriously and not play the role seriously. Or even just like not direct it seriously or not like really write it seriously, you know what I mean? To make it feel like it's real, like it's really happening, which is the whole value of fantasy to begin with, is to put you into this fantasy world and make you feel like it's real. Just for 2 hours, just for the length of time of the movie, or even if you're reading a fantasy book, just for that length of time where you into the story, it takes you away from the everyday, the mundane, and puts you in this other world. A lot of people reading Harry Potter, maybe as kids they wanted to have that adventure, like Harry Potter had. And Harry Potter didn't have a great life. He had a good life once, he went to that school for magicians and found out who he really was, but before then his life sucked. I mean, it was the same. It was a very, very much like a Cinderella story, with the 3 evil stepsisters. He was in that kind of situation. And then somebody like the fairy godmother or whatever it is, or like in his case, the other characters in the story, took him away from that place where he lived that he didn't like and put him somewhere in this beautiful castle, whatever it is, in this school for wizards. And it's sort of like a metaphor for like movies that take you away from the mundane, the everyday, something that could be boring and puts you into this amazing world just for a period of time. And so that's kind of the difference, and that good fantasy movies are taken seriously, right? But sometimes it's easy to write fantasy that's kind of too far out that people can't believe that it's real. Even the Dune movie was taken very, very seriously, and everyone believed in it. The actors were actually good. What they did with Dune is they didn't just focus on the special effects, which they got it really right. And this was before CGI. With the Dune came in the early 80s, before CGI. But they spent $10 million on the special effects and the scenes and the background and everything like that. They got good actors, really good actors to play, and actresses to play the roles. It was written well. It was directed by David Lynch, a very, very good director. This was movie impossible to make. Because, I mean, what do you, like, how do you take this world that's been built, in a book, in a novel, in a series of novels, and create a movie out of it? And they figured, okay, we're just going to tell the main story for 2 hours from beginning to end, and we'll just, like, ignore everything else. Because you cannot, like, world build in a 2-hour movie. You can world build in a series, which that's why I like series now, because you can world build. Because series go on for seasons. It's like one season, it could be 20 hours of content, or it could be 30 hours of content. And you watch 5 seasons, it's like 100 hours of content. 100 hours of content in a series is enough to world build and create a lot of characters and have things change and the plots to change and everything to happen, And I think that's the main difference, is what they started doing was, because the CGI was there and it was good, people took it a little bit more seriously because it wasn't silly. It's like, it's one thing to have special effects to make things look like they're happening, like, cars are blowing up, or there's a chase scene. This is why people like chase scenes. And it was, usually fantasy movies don't have chase scenes, but chase scenes are cool because these are real cars driving on real roads with stunt people and crashing into other cars, and stuff is blowing up, and like, it's exciting, it's interesting, it's fun. When they shoot machine guns in like an action movie, it's fun to see that, because it's just like it's a whole, it's exciting, it's fun to see something like that. It's not fantasy, but because it's sort of realistic, it gets people into it. People kind of believe it because it's more realistic. It's done in the everyday. Fantasy movies don't sometimes appear realistic. It's the job of the person creating the fantasy movie to make the viewer feel like it's real, because a lot of the scenes in fantasy movies are not realistic. They're just castles in medieval places, and, people sort of in the past, and people like maybe Vikings or something like that, people with swords, people with magic, wizards, and things like that. All of these things that a lot of people, it's just not in the world. It's not in the real world. And because it's so made up, it's easy to make it feel made up. But the difference between a good story and a bad story is the good story doesn't feel made up. The good story feels real. Even no matter how weird and wild and wacky and far out it is, the good story feels real. The people telling that story tell it like it's real, Whereas like a bad story, it's not really a bad story. It's just like, maybe it's far out and unbelievable, but that's the thing. You don't believe that it's real. In my opinion, there are some series on like Netflix, for example, that, you could see how the actors and everyone involved in that series, in the movie, whatever it is, they take it seriously. They have this real weird fantasy world with fantasy elements and things like that. And it feels real. It feels like they believe it, so you believe it. They believe it and they act inside this world, and they make it believable. They make it feel real to the viewer. Whereas, like, if the actor doesn't really understand their role and takes it a little bit like, I'm not, where the people watching it is like, I'm not really convinced that this actor is playing. I'm not convinced that this character is real. I'm not convinced that the way they reacted to this scene felt real. I'm not convinced that what they're saying could be a real person saying that. It's just like there's non-believability, and I think that's the whole thing. And some people believe in fantasy, in the fantasy worlds, and they feel like they're real, and other people in some stories is just like they're just like not believable because the people involved in telling that story don't believe it. Or maybe it's written in a way and maybe said in a way that's just like people don't behave that way. I mean, people behave that way in a fiction story. People don't behave that way in real life. And so, it's sort of a fantasy realism where part of it is fantasy, but the fantasy is played out and it makes the viewer feel like the fantasy is real. And that's the difference, I think, in like a good story, that the fantasy feels real. Whereas like in a fantasy that isn't a great story, I think the fantasy doesn't feel real. It just doesn't feel, it's not believable. If it's not believable, it's kind of not interesting. You know what I mean? It's got to be believable. If you look at every example of any great story, if you ever think about any great fantasy movie, if you look at the scenes that you remember from that fantasy movie, or you watch a fantasy movie, you'll see the difference between believing that, a believable scene where, how the actors take it seriously and believe in what they're saying and believe that it's real, and a not believable scene, and how the difference of how it makes you feel, right? It just makes you feel like, this isn't really, I'm not into this movie, right? Whereas like really, really getting the audience into the story. And that's what happens, is that like, that's another aspect of a great movie or a great fantasy movie. It gets the audience into the story. The more you watch it, the more into the story you get. And I think that's an intention by the actors, by the producers, by the directors, the writers, to get the viewers into the story. So the more you watch it, the more you get into it. And this is why sometimes you watch a series and then, it'll take like 5 episodes or 6 episodes to get into it. But once you're into it, now you want to watch the whole thing, It's sort of like that. But that's the difference. I think it's one of the differences is it makes it feel real. And what really makes it feel real? Well, all of the elements that are in there make it feel real. Like, it's a human story. It's a story about people where feelings are real, emotions are real, the way people behave toward each other is real. There's a lot of what's real in it. If you could see how fake it is. If it's fake, and it's like this person says this thing and this person responds, and it just feels like, this person really didn't respond in a believable way, like to what this person said, because no one really would have responded that way, and it just feels like it doesn't feel like it's really real. And if it doesn't feel like it's real, you're not going to get into the story. And so that's the other part of it, is that make it feel real so that people get into the story and have the intention that you're trying to get the viewer into the story. And everything that the story's telling, all the different scenes and the plot twists and everything, gets the person deeper and deeper and deeper more into the story. Star Wars did this really, really well. Obviously, any story with a lot of sequels did it really, really well. Like even Harry Potter did this really well. Obviously, J.K. Rowling, she's made several books of Harry Potter, and people read one to the next, and people just read all of them. Lord of the Rings, it's the same thing. Star Wars is like, I would say probably one of the main known ones, because it started in 1977, and they're still making Star Wars now. And it is like legitimately, it's like over more than 40 years later, people are still into Star Wars, buying the little toys, reading the comics, reading the books, watching the movies, complaining about how bad the movies are recently, And I think that's what it is. If you look at like a good actor, they're believable and they make you feel the reality of the role. Whereas like a not good actor can't do that. Look at Harrison Ford. I mean, Harrison Ford, for example, in Blade Runner 2, I think it's 20 something, whatever it is, the second Blade Runner. They put Harrison Ford into the second Blade Runner, but they made him not a star role, a leading role. They made him like a secondary role, but the amount of time that he spent as that person, I feel like the whole, I mean, it was okay. It was like the second Blade Runner was an okay movie. It was all right because compared to the first, it wasn't as good, but it was an okay movie. But if you look at, inside the second Blade Runner movie was a different character. It was a different lead role, and it was a person that was not, obviously didn't have the acting talent of Harrison Ford. And it just felt like, okay, so the movie, I'm following the movie's happening, I'm watching the movie. And then all of a sudden, I'm surprised that, oh my God, Harrison Ford is in this movie. And then he's in that movie for like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, at which time, all of a sudden, that movie goes from average to really good. And then he's in the movie, and then he's not in the movie, and then the movie continues without him. And then when he's not in the movie's just average. And that's the difference between a really good actor who can make even an average movie amazing just by being in that movie, just by the way they're acting, just by them understanding the character, the world, and how that character would really feel, not just reciting the lines in a way that character would have recited those lines if the situation was real and if that character was real. That's the difference. Good actors feel the character. They understand the character. They make that character real. Whereas like people that are not great actors can't do that. They can't. They're just sort of like finding like, who is this character? How can I be this character, right? Instead of what is the reality of this character? How, it's steeped in reality, rather than like steeped in, there's a lack of understanding of what is like a good way, a compelling way to tell the story, And I think that's just a bunch of things. I mean, obviously characters, actors, characters, that's another reason why a really good story is a really good story, because of actors and that. And I think that now that, there's a lot of CGI, which is better, and it looks really impressive now. I mean, it looks really good. And it's done by artists, and now special effects are like better art. It's sort of like someone who's on an art journey who just got better and better with art, and now the art is just believable. It looks really real. And I think that's what it is with special effects in the modern movies, is they're a lot more believable. They look real. They look real because they're computer generated, and the old special effects didn't look that real, and so it was not believable. The Godzilla, the rubber Godzilla suit and the fake Tokyo, and then, trampling the buildings, and, the fake airplane models that are just blowing up in the air just weren't real looking, So that's what I think about all that. Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments about what makes like fantasy movies great and why some are better than others or worse than others. Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want to like and subscribe. That'd be really cool. Check out my other videos if you want. Turn on notifications because I'm always making new videos, and I will see you guys in another video. Take care.